Slavite go Gospoda, zašto je dobar, Alleluia.
Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name is Nick, the master prayer artist behind Orthodox Handmade, and welcome to our 27th episode on YouTube, where we'll be delving deeper into the topic of Orthodox skull symbolism. As you all probably know by now, I've become quite well known on social media for my extremely popular Golgotha Orthodox prayer ropes, which display skull beading. In saying that, many Christians, and even Orthodox Christians, continue to bombard me with daily messages or comments on Instagram and Facebook asking, why are you using those horrifying skull beads on your Orthodox prayer ropes? And stating things like, you cannot be an Orthodox Christian if you use those death heads, and how dare you insult our faith? So, I thought it would be beneficial to bring attention once again to this seemingly controversial topic. Now, this episode is technically a part 2 of my previous video entitled Let's Talk About This Orthodox Skull Symbolism, where I delve into the specifics of what the skull symbolizes, where and what Golgotha is, why Jesus Christ is the second Adam, and how skull beading on prayer ropes is used to remind one of their own mortality. At the time of this recording, that episode has over 16,000 views and will be linked in the description below, so guys, be sure to check it out if you haven't seen it yet. This part 2 video will go on to discuss Orthodox monk burial rituals on Mount Athos, the influence of the peninsula's soil in decomposition of the body, the meaning of a monk's skull color, and of course the ossuaries where their bones and skulls remain. I am aware that in many cultures and religions, skulls are often seen as ominous and sinister, but in the Orthodox Christian reality, especially monastic, it is meant to be a realistic and welcome reminder of death and our impermanence. As such, skulls are not hidden or kept in dark places, but are kept nearby as a constant reminder of our own mortality. Before we continue, if you're new to the channel and appreciate content revolving around Orthodox topics, be sure to subscribe, hit the notifications bell to be notified when new episodes drop, and be sure to smash that like button. This will prompt the YouTube algorithm to recommend Orthodox Handmade's unique content and assist in growing our faithful audience. Speaking of that audience, ladies and gentlemen, some great news. We have officially surpassed 3,000 YouTube subscribers and are currently sitting at 3,352, which is absolutely amazing. Thank you all so much for your love and support. Also, in keeping with tradition, this episode's new subscriber shout out goes to Care356 or Carey356. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you very much for subscribing to Orthodox Handmade. It is very much appreciated. Now let's continue. As the first monasteries were in the deserts of Egypt and surrounding area, burying all of the departed monastics was not always possible due to the soil conditions or lack thereof. Bodies were buried but often soon dug up, and bones respectfully and kindly collected and stored together in ossuaries. In fact, in some monasteries, each skull is inscribed with the person's name and placed on shelves. In the St. Gerasimos monastery in the Judean desert, there are named skulls dating back hundreds of years, and in some of the monasteries on Mount Athos, the skulls date back over 1,000 years. According to some monastics, the color of the skull can indicate the state of the deceased's soul. White colored if they had honestly completed their monastic vows, dark colored if their soul is perishing, and golden colored, potentially even sweet smelling, suggesting that they had achieved the state of righteousness. And in the same way that an icon can miraculously have myrrh stream from it, so too can skulls and bones. Staying in Greece now, the monasteries of Mount Athos are extremely old, and hundreds and thousands of monks have ended their earthly lives in them. But where are all the graves of the reposed? Can it really be that the monks just don't consider it necessary to take care to preserve the memory of their deceased brothers? Anyone that visits Mount Athos monasteries will notice two peculiar things. First, even large monasteries have small cemeteries, and only a few wooden crosses mounted in the ground. Second, the oldest burials in these cemeteries are, at best, 20 or so years old. But how could that be? Now let's take note of the fact that Athonite monks are usually always buried on Mount Athos itself. However, it does sometimes happen, though, that an Athonite monk, due to various circumstances, may end up living in another monastery outside of Athos and thus will be buried there instead. For example, at the Danilov Cemetery in Moscow can be found the revered grave of the Athonite monk Aristocles, who for many years had presided over the Athonite Metochion in Moscow, and thus was buried in Moscow after he reposed. However, any monk that reposes on Mount Athos, even if he had come to the holy mountain from another country for the first time, is not taken to his homeland to be buried, but is buried at the same Athos monastery in which he had reposed. To repose on the holy mountain, in fact, is actually considered a kind of recognition of the deceased's righteousness, and almost a guarantee of the salvation of his soul. An Athonite monk of our time, Hiero monk Gabriel, would always say, "What a joy it is to die on Athos. Here the Mother of God herself meets the monk after his death, guiding his soul on its way from earth to heaven." On Mount Athos, according to tradition, the burial of the deceased is preceded by a special rite. Also, the deceased monk's clothes will not be changed, and neither will his body be washed before the burial. On the one hand, proper hygiene is, of course, always maintained, and on the other, too much care for the body and health in general is considered an unnecessary occupation not worthy of a monk's time. And in fact, this manner of burial is not exactly something unique to Athonite monasticism. For example, in the monastic rite of burial, we read the following: "When a monk reposes in the Lord, it is not appropriate for his body to be washed or be seen unclad." The deceased instead will first be clothed in a schema, and his head will be covered with a kukoulion, which is attire worn by schema monks. Afterwards, a cassock is sewn over the body, serving as a coffin for the deceased, and an icon of the Holy Virgin Mary is placed on his chest. It is worth noting that usually during burial procedure, the icon of the Virgin Mary is only given to women, while men are given the icon of the Saviour. But since Mount Athos is considered to be a place where the Mother of God is especially present, and according to belief is the first to meet the souls of the deceased, the funeral traditions that have formed here are indeed unique. Generally, burial takes place on Mount Athos on the day of death and without a coffin, so that the body may return unto the ground as soon as possible. Such a burial practice is actually common in many religions and cultures. In particular, Abrahamic religions adhere to this rule in accordance with the words that God addressed to Adam before his exile from paradise. "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." After the customary prayer rule is read, the deceased monk is carried by a few fellow brethren to his place of rest and is buried. Afterwards, on top of the grave, the brethren mount a low four-pointed wooden cross on which, using simple paint, is made the most concise inscription, the name of the monk, and the date of his death. Guys, just a reminder to follow Orthodox Handmade on social media, where you can see all the custom tools for prayer and all new crystal icons that I hand make for the faithful all around the world. Should you be interested in having your very own pieces created, there are details in the description below, or you're welcome to personally liaise with myself via direct message on both Instagram and Facebook. Now back to the episode. It should be noted that the Athonite grave, that is the very ground that the body is buried under, is much different than anywhere else. For example, the ground in Russia, which is mostly flatland, does not share in common any of the burial-related problems that inhabitants of the Mediterranean and other mountainous areas face. In Russia, the usual environment where the body of the deceased is placed is usually a homogeneous, soft, crumbly mass. At best, it is soil or sand, at worst, clay. On Mount Athos, however, there is nothing of the sort. Mount Athos is all stone. Sometimes the ground is just a single stone mass, but more often it consists of cobblestones and large gravel. Soil on Mount Athos is in deficit even more than wood is. Therefore, agriculture on the peninsula is practically absent. There are no appropriate conditions for it. And by the way, some time ago in the past, the Russian Pantelimon monastery on Mount Athos had soil delivered to it by sea, so that the monks, despite harsh conditions, would nonetheless be able to plant a few gardens. Pretty much the largest garden is at the Great Lavra Monastery, which had about 40 yards of land. And no doubt the soil for this garden was also brought from elsewhere, for the ground around the monastery is mostly all stone. As for the ground of the surrounding roads, it is either siliceous or consists of dense red soil resembling something like grated brick. Now, let's take a look at the following scenario. A monk in one of the Athonite monasteries reposes in the Lord. In order to bury him, the brethren of the monastery have to urgently fulfill an extremely laborious obedience. Prepare the place of burial for their deceased brother. Let us not forget that the deceased, according to monastic customs, are buried as soon as possible, usually on the very day of their death. Little by little, or rather stone by stone, the hard-working monks, with their shovels ringing, dig through the rough terrain of Mount Athos. Finally, the grave is complete, and the body of the deceased brother is gently placed within. But now what? Will they really fill the grave back up with all those stones and boulders they just dug up? For a cause such as this, they do manage to find enough soil. Now let us again keep in mind the deficit of soil on Mount Athos, as this circumstance will soon help us understand the reason behind other important burial customs on the Holy Mountain. With the grave now covered and topped off with a small mound of earth, and the wooden cross with its inscription mounted in place, the burial is complete. Now, here is the incomprehensible part of the procedure to one who is not familiar with Athonite burial customs. In just 3 years' time, the grave will be dug up, and the deceased brother's bones will never again return to their former place of rest. On Mount Athos, a monastery brotherhood prays for newly reposed monks with special diligence and attention. For the first 40 days, the entire brotherhood of the monastery reads the customary prayer rule for the reposed, repeating it according to the amount of knots on their prayer ropes. Also, in memory of the reposed monk, the monastery prepares kolivo, also called kutia in Russian, a ritual memorial dish which consists of some grains such as wheat, rye, oat or rice, as well as honey, raisins and nuts. Furthermore, for the following 3 years, the deceased is commemorated at every liturgy during the proscomedia. Now, bearing in mind that the divine liturgy in the monasteries is served daily, this means that the deceased monk receives commemoration every day for quite a long time. Finally, the name of the deceased is also recorded in a special memorial monastery book, the so-called kuvaras, which bears record of the names of all the deceased monks that have lived in the monastery from the time of its very foundation. For example, the kuvaras of the Great Lavra Monastery, read during special memorial days, has been recording the names of its brethren to this very day since the 10th century. After 3 years have passed, the grave of the newly reposed monk is carefully dug up, and the brethren now examine the remains of the deceased to see what state they're in. If the soft tissues of the body are not completely decomposed yet, the grave will be covered up in likewise manner, and the following procedure will be repeated again until it is clear that only the bones remain. By the way, according to Athonite tradition, a body that is not accepted by the earth, i.e. doesn't decompose, is regarded as a sign that the monk did not make the effort to lead a proper monastic way of life, and that his soul has not found rest in heaven. In such case, the entire brotherhood begins to pray even more diligently, beseeching the Lord for the forgiveness of sins and purification of their fellow brother's soul. If the bones of the deceased are completely free from flesh, and this, under the Athos climate, whilst also taking into account the terrain, occurs most often in just about 3 years, they are taken taken out of the grave and after being thoroughly washed with water and wine are transferred to the ossuary, which is a building that resembles a chapel and is usually located somewhere nearby outside the walls of the monastery. As for the empty grave, it is now ready to grant rest for another 3 years to someone else after he reposes. So now we know how Mount Athos manages to solve the problem of soil deficit and why there are so few graves in the cemeteries of these ancient monasteries. As it turns out, there can't possibly be too many graves, as there is a constant rotation going on that many at first aren't aware of. Now, an ossuary is, in essence, a crypt, but the peculiarity of the crypt lies in the fact that the deceased, or rather their remains, are not hidden there, but are in plain sight. The skulls are lined up in rows along the shelves, while the other bones are neatly laid right on the floor along the walls. The names of the monks and the date of their death are usually found written on each skull. Here is how the well-known Russian writer Boris Zaitsev, who visited Mount Athos at the beginning of the 20th century, described the ossuary of the Skeet of St. Andrew. I quote, "The ossuary of St. Andrew's Skeet is a rather large, secluded and well-lit room on an underground floor. Inside the ossuary is found a cupboard with 5 human skulls. On each is inscribed a name and a date. These were the abbots of the Skeet. Then on the shelves lay the skulls, about 700 of ordinary monks, which also have inscriptions. And, finally, what to me seemed most incredible, small bones, the hands and feet, were neatly put together in stacks near the wall, reaching up almost to the ceiling. All this was done with the most profound care that is inherent to this kind of burial tradition. It seemed to me that the only thing missing from this whole picture was a monk that would spend time here keeping record of things and compiling biographies of the reposed brethren. There is some literature present here as well. On the wall, by the way, hangs a saying that the brethren themselves composed. 'Remember, O brethren, that we were once like you, and you will once become like us.'" End quote. Thus, in such a manner do the Athonite monks lay at rest after reposing in the Lord, with the ossuary basically serving them as a common mass grave. It's also worth noting that on Athos, it is thought that the colour of the skull of a reposed monk is a sure sign of whether or not the monk's life was well pleasing to God. Thus, according to this belief, the skulls of the righteous have a beautiful yellowish shade. They look as though they are emitting light and sometimes even produce a sweet-smelling scent. The monks that have honestly carried out their monastic vows have white-coloured skulls, and a dark-coloured skull, on the other hand, signifies that the judgment of the departed monk's soul due to his sins did not have a positive outcome. The last case, however, is quite rare on Mount Athos. The ossuaries on Mount Athos are never locked. Any inhabitant of the monastery can at any time enter the ossuary and in solitude reflect on the transience of life, looking at the bones of monks whom he once knew, or of those who had reposed centuries ago. It is unlikely that one would not come to the thought that they themselves will one day find rest here along with their fellow brethren. Now that is truly something to ponder for the monk. However, monks do not all fear ending up here in this gloomy house of bones, knowing for certain that there is no need to fear death, for it has already been defeated by the risen Christ. Well, there you have it, guys. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this episode and have gained a better understanding of the Orthodox monk burial rituals on Mount Athos, the influence of the peninsula's soil in the decomposition of the body, and the meaning of the monk's skull colour, and of course, the ossuaries of Mount Athos. It is important to understand that skulls and their symbolism represent so much in Orthodoxy. They are definitely not evil, guys, as some like to say, and I will always offer them as beading options for the custom Orthodox prayer ropes that I handmake for the faithful. Let me know in the comments section below if you thought skulls had no purpose on a prayer rope, or if this episode has changed your mind. If you still believe that I'm incorrect after watching this video, let us know why in the comments section. I, along with many subscribers, are always interested in your beliefs on this subject. If you like the content that I'm creating, be sure to subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget we do new subscriber shoutouts, so if you're a new subscriber, let me know in the comments section below by writing subscribed. Now as for our upcoming episode, all I can tell you at this stage is that it involves Vladimir Putin's relationship with the Orthodox Church, and a weird one at that. Stay tuned and watch the upcoming episode that will appear on your screen now. Thank you so much once again for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe and God bless.
Славите го Господа, за што